Solo Vende Tacos Orives is not just a story of survival, but a dive into the difficult choices that shape a man's destiny. The path of Andres, son of a crime legend, leads us to question how far someone would go to escape a dark legacy and find their own purpose. If you were intrigued by what happened next, sign up now and don't miss the continuation of the most intense and unpredictable stories. Every decision Andres makes, every twist and turn along the way could change everything, and you'll want to be here to see it all. Be sure to follow for more stories and to stay tuned for the next chapter of this exciting journey. What comes next may surprise you even more. On a busy street in the heart of Guadalajara, a small taco cart catches the eye of passers-by. That modest and unassuming place became famous for its simplicity and, at the same time, for the unique flavor of its tacos, prepared by an ordinary man named Andres. He wasn't a renowned chef, but his skill with seasoning and his technique for grilling the meat quickly won over the locals. However, there was something more about that little stall that made it special, the mystery surrounding his life. Andres didn't have many friends. His life consisted of hard work, trying to please customers, and in moments of silence, reflecting on what had led him there. He came from a humble family, without many prospects beyond survival. But what few knew was that Andres's father, still alive, was someone feared and respected, a controversial figure who, many years before, had been involved in drug trafficking. What Andres also didn't know was that his past was about to resurface irreversibly. On an ordinary day, while he was preparing tacos, something unexpected happened. A luxury car stopped abruptly in front of the stall, drawing everyone's attention. Two imposing men dressed in black got out of the vehicle. They approached Andres unceremoniously, ignoring the line of customers who waited patiently. The smell of tacos mingled with the strong scent of leather and gasoline. "They sell bad tacos, huh?" said the first one, with a sarcastic smile. "And does, but someone always buys, right?" Andres replied, remaining calm, although he wondered who those people were. The other man, more corpulent and with a visible tattoo on his neck, watched Andres closely as if studying him. He then said, in a deep and implacable voice, "You know that CJNG charges for protection in the area, right? You have to pay for the flooring. Everyone who sells around here has to contribute." Andres didn't understand immediately, unaware that they were referring to the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, one of the most feared factions in Mexico. He frowned, feeling a chill, but still tried to maintain his composure. "Look, if your taco isn't happy, you can leave. I'm not selling anything illegal here," he replied, a little more nervous but still confident. The man in the car moved even closer, almost menacingly. "You don't know who you're talking to, my friend. This is CJNG territory. We'll keep what's ours, and you pay for the protection." Andres already sensed that something was wrong, but the truth would only come later. Those men didn't know that his father's real name was Joaquin, and that decades ago he had been an ally of the cartel itself. The name Chapo echoed in the walls of Andres's memory, but he had never known the weight of what that meant until that moment. The situation quickly escalated when one of the men tried to pressure him, and he unintentionally defended himself more aggressively than he should have. In the heat of the moment, one of the men, the younger one, pulled out a gun. It was a small mistake, but a fatal one. "You are El Chapo's son, aren't you?" said the man, unable to hide his surprise. Andres froze. How did he know this? How could those men know what he himself was trying to bury in his past? The tension grew, and the weight of the threat hung over his head. The revelation that he was the son of a legendary Mexican crime figure cast a heavy shadow over the atmosphere. Those men, who had arrived as a common threat, now looked at him differently. The tallest man's eyes gleamed with understanding, but a visible concern also emerged. After all, dealing with El Chapo was a dangerous game. But Andres had no idea what was coming. What he didn't know was that the cartel had already marked him long ago, but for reasons he could never have imagined. Guadalajara was not an unfamiliar city to Andres. He grew up there, in a simple neighborhood, with simple people. However, that Mexico, with its mix of tradition and modernity, was never easy to understand. Drug trafficking, the weight of a bloody legacy. All of this formed the backdrop of Andres's life, without him having chosen that path. The figure of his father, Joaquin El Chapo, was something distant, a shadow. Andres never fully knew his father, and the stories about him were almost legends whispered by those who feared or admired him. As a child, Andres knew his father was different, but he never fully understood what that meant until adolescence, when Joaquin's story began to be revealed in fragments, never clearly. His mother, Luisa, always made a point of keeping Andres away from any involvement with crime. She raised him alone, supported by the small taco stand they opened when he was just a boy. She didn't talk much about her husband's past, and any mention of Joaquin's name would make her react with a distant look and a serious expression. But Andres, even being the son of a feared man, always felt that his life should be different. Over the years, he became a quiet and observant man, someone who preferred the peace of his work to the hustle and bustle and violence that shaped his father's legacy. He didn't know what to do with Chapo's inheritance. He didn't want his father's recognition. The only thing that interested him was the simplicity of things, selling tacos, smiling at those who bought them, and continuing with his quiet life. But the encounter with the cartel men changed everything. They weren't there by chance. They had been tracking Andres for some time, investigating his every move without his knowledge. For the CJNG men, a Chapo never completely disappears, and the name was enough for the cartel to begin projecting its own intentions onto him. Mexico, with its narrow, bustling streets, its traditional festivals and music, but also its darker sides, was shaping Andres in ways he never imagined. The details of the country's daily life began to appear in the characters' interactions. The sound of maracas in the background of parties, the strong aroma of spices in tacos, the constant presence of corrupt police officers, and the tension on street corners, where the shadows of a heavy past never dissipated. But as the weeks passed, the cartel's threats began to affect not only his routine, but his very identity. Andres began to wonder how much he really knew about his father. There were rumors that Joaquin was still running operations from beyond the grave, that his network of allies was spread everywhere. Some said he never really died, but was hiding, waiting for the right moment to return to power. Meanwhile, Andres tried to move on with his life, attempting to find a balance between the few clients who knew him and the sinister figures who were beginning to get closer and closer. He felt the pressure, but didn't know who to trust. Even the local police were immersed in a web of bribes, and even the neighbors looked at him with suspicion, knowing he was El Chapo's son, but also fearing getting involved in anything that would link him to the cartel. However, fate had other plans. As he tried to distance himself from everything involving his father's name, a new wave of threats began to form, and this time it wouldn't be easy to escape unscathed. The impact of the cartel's threats soon became unavoidable. Andres' small taco stand, once a simple and safe place, began to become a meeting point for shady characters. In the first few days after the encounter with the CJNG men, Andres tried to ignore the pressure. He continued selling his tacos, and some loyal customers still showed up, despite the growing tension in the air. However, he soon realized that something was deeply wrong. Visits from other cartel members began to become more frequent, and they were no longer the imposing figures of before. Now they were young men with flashy tattoos and menacing looks. They seemed to watch Andres's every move, subtly but constantly. From time to time, one of them would approach, place an order, and upon paying, leave a note with a veiled threat. The cartel is waiting. But it wasn't just the cartel that was surrounding him. The city of Guadalajara, which had once seemed like a familiar place, was now a minefield. The local police, often corrupt, also began to show signs of interest. Certain officers started visiting him, but always in disguise, as if they were there for some obscure reason. One night, as Andres was closing his stall, a policeman approached with a strange, almost calculating look. "Do you have any idea who you are, kid?" asked the police officer directly, but without making a fuss. Andres, confused, shook his head. "I don't know what you're talking about. I only sell tacos." The police officer gave a discreet but cynical smile. "Sure, tacos. But he's Joaquin Guzman's son, right? El Chapo." Andres felt a chill. How did he know? His father's name still echoed like a ghost throughout the country, but no one spoke of him with such ease. "I don't know anything," she replied, trying to remain calm. The policeman laughed. "Yeah, El Chapo controlled everything around here, and you didn't even know it. You won't be able to escape his legacy, no matter where you go." Before leaving, he left a business card, but instead of his name, it simply said, "Turn around." Andres was becoming increasingly isolated. The pressures were mounting, and things that had once seemed clear began to blur into a whirlwind of uncertainty. He knew he couldn't continue like this. But the problem was that with each attempt to distance himself, he drew closer to the center of a conflict he never wanted to be involved in. The situation worsened even further when he learned through a close friend that his father, El Chapo, had left a hidden legacy somewhere in the city. This legacy wasn't just money or property, but something far more valuable to the cartels, a network of information and alliances that could shift the balance of power in Mexico. This was something the CJNG couldn't let slip away, and now Andres was at the center of it all, not by choice, but by the inheritance he never asked for. However, the mystery surrounding Joaquin's legacy wasn't the only intensifying conflict. The cartel men, beginning to realize that Andres possessed something potentially useful, started acting more aggressively. They began sending more direct messages. One rainy night, one of the men appeared at the shack with a pistol and in a threatening tone said, "You're either going to help us, or you'll see what happens when the cartel doesn't get what it wants." Andres was beginning to understand that running away was no longer an option. The death threats were becoming more real, and the cartel's attacks were getting heavier every day. He needed to make a decision. What would he do with his father's legacy? What could he do to survive this impending confrontation? With each passing day, Andres felt the pressure growing. The weight of his father's name seemed to increase, and he didn't know how to escape this situation without being swallowed by it. The cartel men weren't just after money or protection of the area. They were after something more, something Andres didn't even fully understand. The mystery surrounding his father was beginning to intertwine with the imminent danger, and he had no idea what kind of game was about to be played. While Andres tried to deal with the direct threats from the cartel, his personal life was also beginning to be shaped by events beyond his control. The city of Guadalajara, with its contrasts of modernity and tradition, seemed like a mirror to Andres's internal struggle. He was being forced to confront not only his father's legacy, but also the shadows that haunted his own identity. One of the most important subplots revolved around his relationship with Clara, a woman who, over the years, had become more than just a customer of his tacos. Clara was an independent young woman with a sharp mind and a quiet strength that drew the attention of those who knew her. She grew up in Guadalajara, but with a different perspective than most. While many were preoccupied with the power of the cartel and the weight of tradition, Clara wanted more than just survival. She wanted to change things. Andres and Clara met on one of those quiet days when the taco stand was empty and the afternoon sun shone on the dirty city streets. She had a curious but unhurried look. When she approached Andres, he noticed the way she analyzed her surroundings, as if she had a deeper awareness of what was happening. Over time, they became friends, and Clara began to question Andres about his life, his past, his connection to El Chapo. "Why don't you talk about your father?" she asked one afternoon while waiting for her taco. Andres always avoided the conversation, but Clara wouldn't give up. "I know you have something to do with this. I don't know exactly what, but I can see the cartel is following you. You can't run from this forever, Andres." This constant interaction between the two grew slowly, and although Andres tried to distance himself, something inside him told him that Clara might be the only person he could trust. However, this friendship would soon become a double-edged sword. Clara was more involved in the situation than he imagined. She, who seemed distant from the danger, actually had her own connections, much deeper to the Guadalajara underworld than he knew. Her family, unbeknownst to Andres, had ties to a rival faction of the CJNG Cartel. These secret ties could be the key to Andres's freedom, but also a fatal risk for both of them. As the conflict with the cartel intensified, Clara began revealing valuable information to Andres, offering him a chance to escape the fate the cartel was trying to impose. She spoke of escape routes, hideouts, and strategies that could save his life, but with each step, she also sank deeper into danger, tying her own family to the factional conflict. Clara was torn between the desire to help Andres and loyalty to her own family, who, while wanting to rid Guadalajara of violence, would not hesitate to use their own weapons and resources to protect their interests. Meanwhile, tensions with the cartel only increased. Andres began to realize that the threats weren't just about him. The cartel was willing to strike at everything he loved, and that included Clara. One night, while walking to the tent, Andres found a note nailed to a nearby wall. "Clara will suffer if you don't cooperate." From that moment on, the line between what he would do to protect Clara and what he would have to do to save his own life became blurred. He didn't know who to trust, but he knew that if he wasn't quick, he would lose everything. At the same time, the city of Guadalajara never stopped. His days became a mixture of work, tension, and distrust, and at every turn, the pressure increased. More police officers began to close in, and more cartel members appeared to watch him. But the worst part wasn't what he already knew. The worst part was what he didn't yet know. Every decision he made seemed to tighten the ties between him and the CJNG, and the threats against Clara became more palpable. One night, Clara finally told Andres something he hadn't expected. She had found a way to escape, but not without making a sacrifice. Her involvement with the rival faction of the cartel, though motivated by a quest for justice, now placed her in a position where she would have to choose between betraying her own family ties or losing herself completely to the underworld. Andres, for his part, felt he was being pushed into a corner. His simple life as a taco vendor no longer existed. He could no longer ignore the weight of his lineage. He was faced with an impossible choice: accept the pressure of the cartel and live in the shadow of his father, or take control of his own destiny, risking everything to save those he loved, and perhaps even himself. The tension that had been building up in recent days finally exploded in an unexpected way. After weeks of threats, intrigue, and difficult choices, Andres's moment had finally arrived. He knew he could no longer hide behind the false promises of a simple future. The CJNG Cartel was determined to exact a price for his father's legacy, and those involved in his personal life were being dragged into the center of this conflict. In the early hours of a Friday morning, when the city was empty and the streets silent, Andres was awakened by a strange noise at his door. When he went to the entrance, he found Clara, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. She was trembling and holding a letter, bearing the cartel's seal, which seemed like a direct threat. "Andres, you need to see this. They know where you are," said Clara, her voice faltering. Andres picked up the paper with trembling hands and read it. The letter was a direct message, threatening Clara and giving her a deadline to deliver what was owed. But what shook him most was not the death threat. It was the name on the letter, Joaquin Guzman. They not only knew about their father, But they were now searching for something more. Something Andres didn't know existed. Something that could change everything. Joaquin's name wasn't there by chance. The letter mentioned a specific hideout, a place Andres had never heard of, but which seemed to be the center of everything the cartel was looking for. What the cartel didn't know, however, was that this hideout had been sealed by Joaquin long before his disappearance. And only Andres knew where the key to open it was. The secret of his father's past was finally revealed in a brutal way. The hideout wasn't just a place for illicit resources, as the cartel members had thought. It was much more than that. It was a complete archive, full of detailed information about all the operations and alliances Joaquin had built over the years. This included international contacts, transactions, and perhaps most importantly, control over the CJNG and its rivals. It was the key to dethroning the cartel, but at the same time, the key to destroying anyone who tried to use it. Andres was speechless. He knew there was no turning back now. Not only was he caught in the middle of the conflict, but so were the people he loved. Clara, in particular, seemed to be more involved than he had imagined. She knew about the hideout, but had never told him everything. For a moment, Andres felt betrayed. The tension of everything that had happened between them, the unspoken lies and omissions, seemed to overwhelm his mind. However, Clara, with tears in her eyes, revealed what she knew. She not only knew the hideout, but also knew of the existence of a rival faction that wanted to destroy the CJNG from within. Her own family, with ties to this faction, was willing to help, but there was a price. Clara knew she couldn't back down. Her involvement with the rival cartel was much deeper than Andres imagined. She was willing to sacrifice her own family to end the CJNG's dominance, but that meant she would have to betray her own blood. Andres was at an impasse. He no longer wanted to live in the shadow of his father's name, but by discovering the hideout, he also found himself facing the possibility of taking control of his own destiny. The options were clear, but none of them were safe. Using the hideout to destroy the cartel would mean more than just a war with the factions. It would affect everything and everyone around him, including Clara, who was becoming more than just an ally. She was becoming a central piece in this dangerous game. The choice Andres faced wasn't just about surviving, but about how he wanted to be remembered. He could reveal the secret and destroy the cartel, but that would require opening the Pandora's box his father had sealed so long ago. The danger would be immense, but the gain could be too. However, he knew that any wrong move could result in all-out war, and he would be the prime target. As the decision formed in his mind, something unexpected happened. During the night, a series of explosions in the distance shook Guadalajara. Buildings trembled, and residents ran into the streets, terrified. The CJNG was attacking with full force. The cartel had decided to act, and the entire city was at risk. "They know where we are. They're coming," said Clara, her eyes filled with despair. It was time to act. What would Andres do now? He had the power to change everything, but that meant risking everything. The explosions that rocked Guadalajara were not merely a sign of violence. They were the beginning of open warfare. The CJNG, with its strength and reach, was attacking with everything it had. The city was transformed into a battlefield. Men and women, friends and enemies, were dragged into the chaos, and Andres knew he could no longer run. The decision he had made to confront the cartel and seek out his father's hideout now had irreversible consequences. At the moment of the explosion, Andres ran to the tent, but when he arrived, the scene was devastating. The street was filled with smoke and debris, and the sound of emergency sirens echoed in the distance. Clara was in a panic, looking around, not knowing what to do. They were being hunted, and the worst was yet to come. The pressure mounted with each passing minute. The cartel not only knew their location, but also had allies infiltrated everywhere. The police were in the middle of the chaos, and Andres feeling he couldn't trust anyone, needed to make a quick decision. Clara, who seemed to be in danger at every turn, insisted they flee, but Andres wasn't sure if fleeing was still an option. They were surrounded. "We can't run anymore, Andres. They know everything about us now." "What are we going to do?" said Clara, her voice trembling but determined. Andres looked out at the street, watching the patrol cars, the shadows of the cartel men moving around the corners. He felt the entire city was against him, and the pressure to take action was almost unbearable. With each breath, he felt the weight of past choices, and his father's legacy seemed more of a burden than ever. The confrontation with the cartel, which until then had been a matter of personal survival, was now something much bigger. They were no longer just trying to survive, they were at war. And Andres knew he needed to act strategically, or all the sacrifice would be in vain. It was then, amidst the confusion, that Clara brought a solution, something Andres hadn't expected. She had discovered a secret route to Joaquin's hideout, a hidden entrance in the heart of the city, where crucial information could be retrieved. But this route was under the control of the rival faction to the CJNG, and the risks of trusting them were immense. "We have to go there, Andres. It's the only way to put an end to this," Clara said, her voice now firmer. Andres knew that following this route was risky, but the alternative was to stay there, waiting for the cartel to find a way to destroy them. With the city in chaos, the rival faction might be their only chance of survival. However, this alliance, fragile and fraught with danger, could be just as risky as the CJNG itself. As they moved forward, the tension was palpable. Every corner could be an ambush, and the smell of betrayal hung in the air. Clara and Andres walked together, but the trust between them was now being tested. Although she was the key to what he needed to do, Andres still didn't know how far she was willing to go to ensure her own survival, and the consequences weren't limited to them. The city of Guadalajara was in a state of total emergency. As gunfire echoed, civilians scrambled for cover, and the streets became a labyrinth of confusion and destruction. The CJNG was advancing relentlessly, but the rival faction was also unwilling to back down. It was an endless conflict, where every move could be their last. Andres's greatest dilemma, however, was not the external war, but the internal one. He knew that by entering his father's hideout, he would be becoming something he never wanted to be, a figure of power in the criminal underworld. Even with Clara by his side, he felt that the choices he made were being driven by forces beyond his control. Joaquin's legacy was not just a distant memory. He was at the center of a storm that now threatened to consume everything. Amidst this storm, a surprise still awaited him. Upon reaching the secret entrance to the hideout, they discovered something that would change everything again. The place, previously considered safe, had been breached. Someone had already arrived before them. And with that, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in a terrifying way. Someone within Joaquin's inner circle, someone with knowledge of the hideout and its secrets, had made a move to secure control of the cartel. Andres felt a chill. What he thought was a survival plan was now revealing itself as a trap. The real war, he would soon realize, was not just against the cartel, but against the ghosts of his father's own past, and against those who betrayed him in the name of a power he never wanted. The blow of reality was stronger than Andres had imagined. Joaquin's hideout, which he had hoped would be his salvation, now revealed itself to be a well-orchestrated trap. The secret entrance was blocked, and the feeling that someone within their own circle had betrayed them hung in the air. The map Clara carried, the only key to survival, now seemed useless. The rival faction of the cartel had arrived first and was probably already in control of everything. But Andres couldn't afford despair. He knew that time was against them, and that, if they wanted to survive, they needed to act fast. The situation demanded more than courage. It demanded a change in his way of thinking, an adaptation to the cruel reality of the world he had gotten himself into. While Clara tried to compose herself, Andres stepped away, observing his surroundings. The weight of his lineage, the burden of being El Chapo's son, was beginning to manifest itself in an unexpected way. He was no longer just the simple man selling tacos on the street. Joaquin's name was now hanging over his head, and everyone's eyes, enemies, allies, and even those closest to him, were on him. The pressure was immense, but he knew he needed to take action. Andres never wanted power nor control. He only wanted a peaceful life, far from violence and fear. But now he was faced with a choice. What would he do with his father's legacy? What would he do with the power the cartel so desperately desired? He could try to run away, leave everything behind, but that meant condemning Clara and possibly himself. He knew there was no escape anymore. It was then, amidst the chaos, that he had a clear vision. Joaquin's secret wasn't just the hiding place, nor the information he had accumulated during his years in power. His father's true legacy lay in how he governed, in how he manipulated situations, people, and the cartels themselves. Joaquin's skill wasn't in his brute strength, but in how he knew how to hide in the shadows and use others as pawns in his game. What Andres needed to do now wasn't to fight head-on, but to play the same game as his father, and he would need to use intelligence and cunning more than strength. With Clara by his side, Andres began to formulate a new plan. Instead of seeking direct confrontation, he decided to create a distraction. The rival faction was so focused on the hideout that they wouldn't notice the movement within the shadows. It was time to turn the tables. Using what he knew about the cartel's operations, he began spreading false rumors, creating a network of disinformation to confuse his enemies. He also used the few connections he had with other cartel members to spread the idea that Joaquin's hideout was somewhere else, distant and inaccessible. This clever, albeit risky move proved to be a temporary success. While the rival faction moved toward the false hideout, Andres and Clara had time to advance along an alternate route that, until that moment, had seemed inaccessible. Clara's trust in Andres was growing, but he knew that with each step they took, the web of betrayal surrounding them became even more complex. He could no longer trust anyone but Clara. The journey to the true hideout was full of challenges. They passed through areas controlled by the cartel, hid in the homes of former allies, and faced moments of despair when it seemed all was lost. But with each obstacle, Andres became more determined, more cunning. He was no longer just trying to survive. He was fighting to control his own destiny, to define who he truly was. When they finally reached safety, Andres was no longer the man who had begun the journey. He was stronger, more prepared, and in a way, closer to his father than he had ever imagined. What he had learned, perhaps painfully, was that survival didn't depend solely on fleeing or hiding. To win this battle, he would need to become someone unafraid, to bear the weight of his legacy, to use what his father left him, not as a curse, but as an advantage. He knew that now, more than ever, he had the power to change the rules of the game. Joaquin's hideout was in his hands, and with it, control of the cartel was within reach. But to achieve this, he would need to be prepared for one last battle, one that would not be won with weapons, but with the sharp mind of someone who understood that true strength lay in knowing when to act and when to wait. What Andres didn't know was that, in this process of growth, he would become something he never imagined, a leader, a man capable of using cunning and intelligence to reverse the course of his life, to achieve something much greater than simple revenge or survival. Andres now knew there was no more room for hesitation. Every move needed to be calculated with precision, and he finally understood what his father had always known. In the world of crime, physical strength and violence were often secondary. The real key to winning lay in who controlled the information and whom they could deceive or manipulate. Time was running out, and the pieces were moving toward the climax. With Joaquin's hideout now in his hands, Andres began to plan his next move. He knew the CJNG wouldn't give up easily. The cartel had invested a lot of time and resources to take control of the city, and the rival faction, now bewildered by the disinformation he had spread, was still a constant threat. But Andres had something they hadn't expected: a strategic advantage. Using the information from the hideout, he formulated a plan that would involve destabilizing the CJNG and at the same time placing the rival faction in a position of weakness. He planned a simultaneous attack on several cartel bases, creating confusion and causing the CJNG to begin questioning its own strength. This plan would require him to utilize both the help of willing allies, such as the few contacts he still had, and cunning to manipulate events to his advantage. Meanwhile, Clara, now more involved than ever, had to confront her own loyalties. She knew that by siding with Andres, she was about to break with her family. Her connection to the rival faction of the cartel, although a means of resisting the CJNG's oppression, was now proving to be an obstacle. She loved Andres, but she also loved the freedom of her city. It was a difficult dilemma: fight alongside Andres or fall into disgrace before her own faction, whose support she knew could be crucial for the next phase of the conflict. On a tense night, as the plan began to take shape, Andres and Clara met to discuss the next steps. "Do you really believe this will work?" asked Clara, her eyes fixed on the map. "They are much stronger than you think. If we do this, there will be no turning back." Andres looked at her, feeling the weight of his decision. He never wanted her to be drawn into that world, but now it was too late for regrets. "I know, Clara, but we have no other choice. If we want to end this once and for all, we have to act while the cartel is still distracted. We have a unique chance to take them down from within." Clara didn't say anything for a moment, as if weighing each word. Then, finally, she nodded. "I'm with you, until the end." This marked the beginning of the final stage of Andres's plan. He not only needed to deal with the CJNG and the rival faction, but also with his own limitations. He knew that by acting so aggressively, he risked losing everything: Clara's trust, his remaining allies, and even the very city he had tried to protect. But war left no room for hesitation. Andres was no longer the man who sold tacos on the street. He had transformed into a strategist, someone capable of manipulating the forces at play. While preparations were underway, he faced one last difficulty: his father's reactions. Joaquin, even in his absence, was still a powerful figure, and the shadow of his image was everywhere. The cartel believed that Joaquin's hiding place was the key to their ultimate domination. But Andres knew there was something much deeper at stake. He wasn't just fighting against the CJNG or the rival faction. He was fighting against his father's own legacy. The night of the attack arrived, and Andres felt a growing tension in the air. He was about to put into practice everything he had learned from his father, but he was also doing it in his own way. The plan was underway, and the game was about to change irreversibly. The fate of Guadalajara, of Clara, and of everyone involved depended on the steps Andres would take now. He could no longer turn back. However, as he observed the city, his eyes attentive and his movements calculated, a strange feeling took hold of his mind. He knew that one last piece was about to be moved, something he couldn't foresee, but knew would happen. War, after all, is not defined by a single move. It is made of surprises, betrayals, and decisions that definitively alter the course of events. Andres was ready to face whatever came his way, but he also knew that the final battle wouldn't just be physical. It would be mental, and he would need to use all the weapons his father had bequeathed to him, including the ability to deceive, manipulate, and, when necessary, destroy. Night fell over Guadalajara, and the air was heavy with the tension of the impending confrontation. Andres and Clara's plan was in motion. The CJNG Cartel, still restructured and now with the rival faction partially disoriented, didn't know what awaited them. Chaos was about to unfold on a scale never before seen in the city. Andres was at the forefront of the battle, along with Clara, the two immersed in a carefully orchestrated strategy. Members of the rival faction were infiltrated in key points of Guadalajara, spreading disinformation, creating distractions, and facilitating the movement of the few allies Andres still had. But even with all the preparations, what he didn't know was that the biggest blow was yet to come from an unexpected place. While attacks on CJNG control points were happening simultaneously, a series of events began to unfold that would challenge everything Andres thought he knew about his father's power and legacy. He had calculated everything, but he hadn't considered the intervention of an unexpected ally, the CJNG Cartel itself. In the midst of the chaos, while Andres's allies dismantled supply points and escape routes, a move was made on the CJNG side that no one could have predicted. In a cunning stroke, the CJNG used the disinformation that Andres himself had spread against him. They had infiltrated enemy lines, sending false messages to Clara and other allies, making them believe that Joaquin's hideout, where crucial information was stored, had been raided by a rival group. It was a ploy to weaken Andres's side and divert attention to a false location. The message reached Clara, who, in her desperation to protect Andres and end the war, led a group of allies toward the false hideout. She didn't know that, in doing so, she was running straight into a trap. But Andres, with his shrewd eye, quickly realized the information was wrong. The rival faction was no longer involved in the attack on the hideout, but the CJNG had orchestrated a trap to kidnap Clara and destroy any chance of victory for Andres. The turning point was immediate. When Clara and her allies arrived at the location, they realized they were surrounded by a superior force, and a confrontation seemed imminent. However, something else was yet to come. A brutal shootout erupted the moment Clara tried to defend herself. She was being taken away by CJNG forces, but what she didn't know was that Andres was already on his way, ready to take an unthinkable action. He couldn't allow Clara to be captured. His transformation from a simple taco vendor to the leader of a ruthless war culminated in a moment where strategy had to be thrown out the window. He had nothing left to lose, and the cartel knew it. At the critical moment, Andres made a radical choice. He would use the information his father had left him, the cartel's secrets, to turn the tables once and for all. In a calculated move, Andres infiltrated the CJNG's command center, using Joaquin's hideout as bait. Upon arriving there, he revealed in a public broadcast to all cartel members the internal flaws that the CJNG had ignored all these years. He exposed crucial information about how rotten the cartel's internal structure was, where the weak points were, and how the rival faction had infiltrated deeper than anyone imagined. It was a bold but brilliant move. The CJNG, weakened by its own internal corruption and the revelations made by Andres, began to disintegrate in real time. With the leadership weakened, members began to doubt, and internal divisions took hold. It wasn't long before the less loyal members turned against each other, transforming what was an uncontrollable monster into a chaotic and vulnerable structure. Clara, who was being taken prisoner, used this moment of distraction to escape. She was rescued by a group of allies who had infiltrated alongside Andres, freeing her at the last second before the CJNG could take her to an uncertain destination. Andres, now at the heart of the cartel's crumbling empire, realized that his move had not only dismantled the CJNG's power structure, but had also forever changed his destiny. He was no longer a mere fugitive or El Chapo's son. He was now the master of the game, the man who had exposed the weaknesses of one of the most powerful factions in the world. With the CJNG in ruins, Chaos in the streets of Guadalajara was inevitable. The rival faction, which initially seemed disoriented, was now advancing to seize power, but Andrés knew that this victory was not the last. In a game where the cards were manipulated and loyalties exchanged like chess pieces, he had become the ultimate victor, but the war was never truly won. It merely changed direction. As he watched the city burn, smoke blanketing the horizon, Andrés knew he was still far from seeing the end of this journey. But he also knew that the power was in his hands now. He had transformed his destiny, stepping out of the shadow of his father's name and becoming something new, something no one could have predicted. With the CJNG finally in ruins and the rival faction consolidating itself as the new power in Guadalajara, the future seemed uncertain. But for Andrés, victory wasn't exactly a triumph of glory. Observing the destruction around him, he wondered if anything had actually been gained or merely destroyed. The city was in a state of emergency. The streets, once full of life, were now deserted, bearing signs of violence and the bodies of victims scattered about. Andrés' allies had won a crucial battle, but the war, as always, continued. The victory over the CJNG did not bring peace, but it did bring a reconfiguration of power, and this change was neither simple nor clean. Andrés met with Clara in a safe place, where they could finally breathe a little after the storm. They had survived, but the price was high. Clara, still shaken by the events, looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "You did what needed to be done, Andrés, but what comes next?" asked Clara, with a tired expression. Andrés took a deep breath. He knew the answer wasn't simple. The power he now wielded wasn't something he had sought, but something imposed upon him. His father's legacy, which he had tried to escape for so long, had now become his responsibility. He was no longer just an ordinary man. He was a key player in a war that, though it had changed sides, continued to be fought in the city's shadows. "I don't know, Clara. What I do know is that I can't go back," he said, his voice firm but filled with an invisible weight. "Everything I did was to gain control over my destiny. But that comes at a price. Not just for me, but for everyone around me. What awaited him no one could have predicted. Andrés's future was now intertwined with the new leadership of the rival cartel, but also with the remnants of the old regime. He knew that to truly break the cycle of violence and oppression, he would need more than destruction. He would need a deeper change, something that not even his father Joaquin had been able to achieve. But that he had time to discover. Clara, standing beside him, seemed to understand what was at stake. What remained was to rebuild, not just the city, but their own lives. Andrés's internal war, between the pursuit of revenge and the desire for redemption, was still raging. And while the city tried to recover, he knew that the battle within himself would continue. As the two gazed at the crumbling horizon, one thing was clear. The end of that war was only the beginning of something new. A new chapter for Andrés, for Clara, and for all those who, directly or indirectly, were involved in this power game. Joaquin Guzman's legacy had finally been undone. But now, Andrés would have to deal with the consequences of that legacy alone. Several months had passed since the fall of the CJNG and the rise of the new faction in Guadalajara. The city was slowly beginning to rebuild, but the scars of war were still visible. Andrés, now a man of power, walked the streets, but in a different way. The weight of his legacy, the constant scrutiny of his actions, never left him. Clara had moved away, following a new path, although the two still shared a silent connection. Guadalajara was being rebuilt, but what would happen next? Andrés knew the power game was far from over. He had turned the page, but the book was still open. Now that Andrés's story has come to an end, it's time to reflect on the choices he made and the price he paid for his freedom. His father's legacy, the struggle for survival and power, all of this makes us question How far would we go to secure our own freedom? And what does winning truly mean in a world where the price of victory is the loss of everything we love? Share your opinions and thoughts. What will André's next move be? Is the war over or is it just beginning? The answer may be in your hands.